Your muscles are disappearing right now, not in a way you can see in the mirror this morning, not in a way that shows up on the scale, but in a cellular process that's been unfolding silently for years. After the age of 30, you lose between 3% to 8% of your muscle mass per decade. By the time you reach 60, if you've done nothing to stop it, you could have lost a quarter of the muscle you had in your prime. This isn't cosmetic. This is about whether you can carry groceries at 75, whether you can recover from a fall at 80, and whether you live independently into your late years or not. Muscle mass is the single greatest predictor of lifespan and health span in adults over 50, stronger than cholesterol, stronger than blood pressure, stronger than your weight. And the most shocking part isn't that we're losing it. It's that one single habit, practiced consistently, can reverse decades of loss and add 10 years to your life. Not 10 years in a bed hooked to machines, 10 years of functional, independent, high-quality living. The habit isn't running marathons. It isn't hours in the gym. It's something most people over 50 have been told to avoid because they think it's dangerous. But the science is absolutely clear, and the patients I've seen transform their lives with this one change are living proof that it works. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in the emergency department, I've seen what happens when preventable decline isn't prevented. I've watched 70-year-olds who can't stand up from a chair without help. I've seen 65-year-olds hospitalized for months after a simple fall because their bones broke and their muscles couldn't support recovery. And I've also seen the opposite, patients in their late 70s and early 80s who are functionally decades younger than their chronological age because they did one thing differently. My goal now is to help people avoid that preventable decline in the first place and live longer, healthier, more independent lives. And I want to take just a few seconds here to make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in the latest research and science, to help you prevent the diseases I see in the emergency department every single day. And all I ask in return is that you give this fairly new channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you didn't think it was worth your time or you've not learned something new, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings, but if you give me your time and your attention, I'll give you everything I've learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out. Hit the subscribe button to help this channel reach more people like you. And let's continue with the video. Before we talk about what adds 10 years to your life, we need to understand what's stealing those years in the first place. And it's not what most people think. It's not heart disease directly. It's not cancer. It's something called sarcopenia, which is the medical term for age-related muscle loss. And sarcopenia is the upstream cause of almost every condition that robs people of independence and years of life after the age of 60. Here's how the process works. Muscle tissue is metabolically active, which means it requires energy to maintain even when you're not moving. Your muscles are constantly in a state of breakdown and repair. Protein gets broken down, new protein gets built. In a healthy state, this balance is neutral. You're replacing what you lose. But after 30, the balance tips. Breakdown starts to exceed repair. This happens for 3 reasons. The first reason is hormonal. Growth hormone and testosterone, which are the primary signals for muscle protein synthesis, decline with age. Less signal means less building. The second reason is that something called anabolic resistance develops. This means your muscles become less responsive to the signals they do receive. Even if you eat adequate protein, your muscle cells don't respond to it as efficiently as they did when you were younger. The third reason is simple disuse. Most adults over 50 move less and lift less than they did in their 20s and 30s, and muscle operates on a use it or lose it principle. If there's no stimulus demanding that muscle stay, the body sees it as metabolically expensive tissue that isn't needed and breaks it down for fuel. Now here's where sarcopenia becomes deadly. Muscle isn't just about strength. It's a metabolic organ. It's the primary site of glucose disposal in the body. When you lose muscle, your insulin sensitivity drops, which increases your risk of type 2 diabetes. Muscle is also a reservoir of amino acids. When you're sick, when you're injured, When you're recovering from surgery, your body pulls from that reservoir to support immune function and tissue repair. If the reservoir is depleted because you've lost 30% of your muscle mass by age 70, your ability to recover from illness or injury is severely compromised. This is why muscle mass is the #1 predictor of survival after surgery, after infection, after trauma, and after critical illness. It's also why muscle loss is so tightly correlated with all-cause mortality. The less muscle you have, the shorter your lifespan, and the worse your quality of life in those final years. Studies published in the Journal of Gerontology have demonstrated that individuals with low muscle mass have a 50% higher risk of early death compared to those with adequate muscle independent of body fat percentage. This isn't about being overweight or thin. This is about the quality and quantity of the tissue underneath. Muscle is protective tissue. Fat, particularly visceral fat that accumulates around organs, is inflammatory tissue. The ratio between the two determines a significant portion of your metabolic fate as you age. The interaction between muscle loss and functional decline is where the real devastation happens, and most people don't realize they're in the trap until it's already advanced. It works like this. You lose muscle slowly and imperceptibly over years. At first, you don't notice. You can still do everything you've always done. Then, one day, you struggle to get out of a low chair, or you feel unsteady going downstairs, or you notice that carrying a bag of groceries from the car to the house is harder than it used to be. These aren't just minor inconveniences. They're warning signs that you've crossed a functional threshold. And here's the trap. Once you notice these difficulties, the instinct is to avoid the activities that feel hard. You stop lifting heavy things. You avoid stairs. You sit more. And the less you do, the faster you lose muscle. This creates a downward spiral. Less muscle leads to less activity. Less activity leads to more muscle loss. More muscle loss leads to further functional decline. Eventually, this spiral leads to frailty. Frailty is a clinical state defined by unintentional weight loss, exhaustion, low physical activity, slow walking speed, and weak grip strength. Once you're frail, your risk of falls, hospitalization, disability, and death skyrockets. And the horrifying part is that frailty is not an inevitable part of aging. It's a consequence of muscle loss that was preventable. What I've seen in the emergency department over and over is that the difference between a patient who recovers from a fall and one who doesn't isn't luck. It's muscle mass. The patient with adequate muscle can absorb the impact, can stabilize themselves, can get up, and can heal. The patient without muscle breaks bones, can't stand, loses more muscle during the recovery period in bed, and often never regains full independence. That's the real cost of sarcopenia. Not just weakness, loss of independence, loss of mobility, loss of years. And what's particularly cruel about this process is that it often happens to people who think they're doing everything right. They're eating balanced meals, they're walking every day, they're watching their weight, but walking alone doesn't provide the mechanical stimulus needed to preserve muscle. It maintains cardiovascular health, which is important, but it doesn't load the muscles enough to prevent breakdown. You need resistance, you need challenge, you need progressive overload. Now, when we understand what causes muscle loss and functional decline, we automatically understand what reverses it. And it comes down to one habit: resistance training. Not cardio, not walking, not yoga. Resistance training, which is the practice of working your muscles against resistance, whether that's weights, bands, or your own body weight. Resistance training is the only intervention that directly stimulates muscle protein synthesis enough to overcome anabolic resistance and rebuild muscle tissue in older adults. Here's the biology. When you put a muscle under mechanical load, meaning you make it work hard enough that it fatigues, you create micro damage in the muscle fibers. This signals the body to repair those fibers and build them back stronger and larger. The signal is called mechanotransduction. It's the process by which mechanical stress is converted into a chemical signal that turns on genes responsible for muscle growth. This process doesn't decline with age. What declines is the stimulus. Most older adults simply aren't putting their muscles under enough load to trigger the repair response. But when you do provide that load, even at 70, even at 80, the muscles respond. They grow, they get stronger, they rebuild the reservoir of tissue that protects you against illness, injury, and functional decline. The research on this is overwhelming. A landmark study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association followed adults aged 60 to 80 who began a resistance training program. After 12 weeks, participants gained an average of 3 pounds of muscle and lost 4 pounds of fat. Their strength increased by 40% to 150% depending on the exercise. Their walking speed improved, their balance improved, and their markers of metabolic health, including insulin sensitivity and blood pressure, improved significantly. But here's what matters most. The gains didn't stop at 12 weeks. Participants who continued training for a year or more continued to build muscle and strength well into their 70s and 80s. And the functional benefits translated directly into real-world outcomes. They were less likely to fall, they were less likely to be hospitalized, they were more likely to remain independent, and crucially, their mortality risk dropped. This wasn't a minor reduction. The difference in mortality between the highest and lowest strength quartiles was comparable to the difference between smokers and non-smokers. That's the magnitude of the effect we're talking about. Strength training literally rivals smoking cessation in terms of its impact on lifespan. Multiple studies have now confirmed that muscle mass and strength are directly correlated with lifespan. Research published in the British Medical Journal found that grip strength, which is a proxy for overall muscle strength, was a better predictor of all-cause mortality than blood pressure. Another study published in the American Journal of Medicine tracked over 3,000 older adults for 7 years. Those in the lowest quartile of muscle mass had more than double the mortality risk of those in the highest quartile, even after controlling for age, chronic disease, and lifestyle factors. This isn't correlation without causation. The mechanism is clear. Muscle protects you metabolically by improving glucose regulation and insulin sensitivity. It protects you physically by preventing falls and supporting recovery from illness. It protects you hormonally by serving as a reservoir of amino acids for immune function. And it protects you functionally by keeping you mobile, independent, and capable of doing the activities that make life worth living. The habit of resistance training is the most powerful intervention we have for extending both lifespan and health span in adults over 50. And the science behind it is stronger than the science behind almost any medication prescribed for longevity or disease prevention. So what does a resistance training program actually look like for someone over 50 who's never done it before or who hasn't trained in years? The first thing to understand is that you don't need to lift heavy weights from day one. You don't need to join a gym. You don't need to spend hours training. What you need is progressive overload, which means gradually increasing the challenge to your muscles over time. This can start with bodyweight exercises like squats, push-ups, or rows using a resistance band. The key is that the exercise must be hard enough that the last few repetitions feel difficult. That's the signal. If you can do 15 repetitions easily, the load isn't high enough. If you can only do 3 repetitions, the load is too high and increases injury risk. The sweet spot for muscle growth is 8 to 12 repetitions, where the last 2 to 3 reps are genuinely challenging. You should aim to train 2 to 3 times per week, targeting all the major muscle groups. This includes legs, which are critical for walking, standing, and balance. It includes your back and shoulders, which support posture and upper body function. And it includes your core, which stabilizes your spine and prevents falls. Each session doesn't need to be longer than 30 to 45 minutes. That's enough time to perform 5 to 7 exercises with adequate rest between sets. Rest is important. Your muscles grow during recovery, not during the workout itself. You need 48 hours between sessions to allow for repair and adaptation. The repair process is where the actual adaptation happens. During the workout, you're creating the stimulus. In the 24 to 48 hours afterward, your body is responding to that stimulus by rebuilding the tissue stronger than it was before. If you train the same muscle groups every day without rest, you're not giving the body time to complete that repair cycle, which means you're limiting your gains and increasing your injury risk. Now, I want to address a concern that almost every older patient raises when I recommend resistance training. They're afraid of injury. They've been told that lifting weights is dangerous for older adults, that it will hurt their joints, that it will cause more harm than good. This is categorically false. Resistance training, when performed with proper form and appropriate load, is one of the safest forms of exercise for older adults. In fact, it's safer than many activities people do without a second thought. Research published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine analysed injury rates across different types of exercise. Resistance training had an injury rate of less than 1% per 1,000 hours of training. Compare that to running, which has an injury rate of 2% to 5% per 1,000 hours. The injuries that do occur in resistance training are almost always the result of poor form, excessive load, or inadequate warm-up, all of which are preventable with proper instruction. If you're concerned about safety, start with supervised sessions with a qualified trainer who has experience working with older adults. Many gyms offer programs specifically designed for people over 50. Alternatively, there are excellent online programs that provide video demonstrations and progression plans. The point is that the risk of not training is far greater than the risk of training. Muscle loss is a certainty if you do nothing. Injury from resistance training is a possibility that can be minimized with proper technique. Now, beyond the physical practice of resistance training, there's a nutritional component that cannot be ignored. Muscle is built from protein. If you're not consuming adequate protein, you cannot build muscle no matter how much you train. The current recommendation for older adults is 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. For a 70 kilogram person, that's roughly 84 to 112 grams of protein daily. Most older adults are consuming far less than this, often less than 60 grams per day. The reason this matters is that aging increases the threshold of protein needed to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. When you were 25, a meal with 20 grams of protein was enough to maximize the muscle building response. At 65, that same meal might only generate 60% of the response. You need closer to 30 to 40 grams of protein per meal to achieve the same effect. This means structuring your meals around high-quality protein sources. Eggs, chicken, fish, beef, Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, and legumes should be prioritized at every meal. If you're unable to meet your protein needs through food alone, a protein supplement such as whey protein can be an effective and convenient option. The timing of protein intake also matters. Consuming protein within 2 hours after a resistance training session maximizes muscle protein synthesis during the recovery window. This doesn't mean you need to drink a protein shake in the gym parking lot, but it does mean that your post-workout meal should include a substantial protein source. Let me bring this back to the emergency department because I want you to see the real-world consequences of what I'm describing. I've treated 2 patients who were both 72 years old. Both fell on ice in the winter. One had been resistance training twice a week for 5 years. The other had not exercised in decades and had lost significant muscle mass. The first patient bruised his hip and was sore for a few days. He walked out of the emergency department and went home. The second patient fractured his femur, required surgery, spent 6 weeks in rehabilitation, developed a hospital-acquired infection during his stay, lost even more muscle mass during the weeks he was immobile, and never regained full independence. He moved to assisted living 4 months after the fall. The difference between these 2 outcomes was not luck. It was muscle. The patient who trained had the strength and tissue quality to absorb the impact. The patient who did not. That's the stakes. Resistance training isn't about vanity. It's not about looking good in a swimsuit. It's about whether you live independently into your 80s or whether you spend your final decade dependent on others. And what the research shows definitively is that it's never too late to start. Even adults in their 90s can build muscle and improve strength if they begin resistance training. The adaptations are slower than they would be at 30, but they happen. Your muscles retain the ability to respond to stimulus throughout your entire life. The bigger picture here is that we've been sold the wrong narrative about aging. We've been told that decline is inevitable, that getting weaker, slower, and more fragile is just part of getting older. That's not true. What's inevitable is the passage of time. What's not inevitable is the loss of function, independence, and quality of life. Sarcopenia is preventable. Frailty is preventable. The spiral into disability that claims so many older adults is preventable. And the intervention is simple, accessible, and supported by decades of research. Resistance training is the closest thing we have to a fountain of youth. It's more effective than any supplement. It's more powerful than most medications. It doesn't require expensive equipment or gym memberships. It requires consistency, progressive challenge, and adequate protein. That's it. The habit of working your muscles against resistance 2 to 3 times per week can add 10 years to your life. Not years of decline. Years of vitality, strength, independence, and function. Years where you can travel, play with grandchildren, hike, garden, and do the things that make life meaningful. And those years aren't just added to the end of your life. They replace the years of decline that would have otherwise been spent in dependency. You're not just living longer, you're compressing the period of disability into a much shorter window at the very end. That's what health span is, and that's what resistance training delivers. So here's the bottom line, and this is what I really want you to take away from this. Muscle mass is the single greatest predictor of how long you live and how well you live in those years. After the age of 30, you lose muscle unless you actively work to keep it. That loss accelerates after 50 and becomes catastrophic after 70 if left unchecked. But the loss is not inevitable. Resistance training reverses it. It rebuilds muscle, restores strength, improves metabolic health, reduces fall risk, increases survival after illness, and extends both lifespan and health span. This is not speculative. It's not a theory. It's proven in study after study across thousands of participants. And I've seen it firsthand in the emergency department in the patients who thrive into their 80s and 90s versus those who decline. The difference is muscle, and the habit that builds muscle is resistance training. It's the one habit that could add 10 years to your life. And finally, just to end, please subscribe to the channel if you found this useful to help me reach more people like you.